Welcome to Tilt, a podcast from the Santa Fe Art Institute. Before this was the City of Holy Faith, it was White Shell Water Place. Alicia, Diego, and Christian look at Santa Fe's indigenous presence and the connections to this land, past and present and future. This is episode 5, part 3, titled Oga Pa'oki.
You are listening to Unsettled.
Got this pine cone in my brain, got my eyes open, I'm saying it's that wake up, that breaking free for them chains. It's that welcome to a new age, this right here for like a new wave.
I'm born and raised in Santa Fe, and my family has been here for so many generations, with different, even myself, I've had times of being away, being distant from this community, but physically, geographically, for like college, and that goes for periods of time in my mother's life, periods of time in my grandfather's life, in my ancestors' lives. So ultimately, this is home. This is the place in the world where I feel the most grounded, and the most centered, and the most nourished.
Santa Fe is home even from afar, says Jade Begay, a multimedia artist who works at the intersections of narrative strategy, indigenous rights, and climate justice. Jade is also the creative director of NDN Collective, an indigenous-led organization dedicated to building indigenous power. Jade draws from her roots in Tesuque Pueblo on her mother's side, as well as from her Dene lineage on her father's. She was born and raised in this city. And even as Santa Fe shifts and groans under the weight of gentrification and sprawl, this land, Jade says, is home to gods and deities still.
There's so many of these places situated across this land, which is now full of developments and homes and weird stuff, too much stuff. And so definitely when I'm driving, from Tesuque to Albuquerque, I'm thinking of these places, and I'm thinking of them in this way, with lots of respect and lots of, I keep saying the word reverence, but it's so true. I love this place. This is my home, like I said.
Where others might see a mountain or even a development, she is reminded of ceremony, ancestors, and a deep history of place.
There's even, we have songs too about all the different songs and different ceremonies dedicated to different, obviously the seasons, but water systems, and the deities that bring water, and so all of those things are definitely considered and thought about in just any given day as I'm walking around or driving around this place. That's kind of like my frame of reference when I look at this place, and I think for other Tesuque people, other Pueblo people, they probably have the same or similar outlooks, perspectives when they're traversing the land and moving across the land.
The question then is, how can Santa Fe and its surrounds mean one thing to one person, a tourist playground, the battlefield for American imperialism to stake its claim, or the stage for the performance of Spanish conquest and identity, and signify an entire sacred geography to someone else? This third episode of Unsettled delves into the significance of land acknowledgements, of recognizing indigenous presence in places like Santa Fe, while also considering where settlers fit in and how we, understand our place within a still unfolding timeline. Because if you didn't know, colonialism and imperialism are ongoing. Erasure and amnesia walk hand in hand. and land acknowledgements, well, they seek to remember. On the evening of June 18th, members of Three Sisters Collective repeated the words Ogapoge from atop the bandstand. With each repetition, the crowd spoke them back, like a call and response, or a massive open-air classroom. People who hadn't heard the Tewa words before learned them for the first time that day. Maybe even the mayor who just made his announcement to take down the obelisk was saying them aloud for the first time. This, the city that most residents know as Santa Fe, the city of Holy Faith, is also Ogapoge. It is White Shell Water Place, the ancestral lands of Tesuque Pueblo. To hear an entire plaza's worth of people speak those words aloud like a chorus was moving. For just a moment, the obelisk at the center of it all seemed to shrink away. Their repetition reminded everyone there, masked up and spread out as they were, that Ogapoge is not bygone. It lives in the here and now, because the indigenous connection to the land is not something that only resides in the past. It is something that is alive today in the people whose connection to this place was never severed. In response to Mayor Weber's call to take down 3 monuments, including the Soldiers' Monument, the governor of Tesuque Pueblo shared these words. It is time that we, all of us who live as neighbors in northern New Mexico and whose families go back generations, take responsibility for our shared history, not seen through one perspective only, but through all of our perspectives. That history is not simple like a fairy tale. It is complex and nuanced, with deep pain and happiness alike. But that is the history we must now start telling, because it is the truth.
Well, and it's not so much discrete either, you know, so that the geography isn't discrete in the sense that we have our sacred mountains that surround each of our communities that sort of set the borders, I guess, of our area of our homelands, so to speak. Now, those overlap with many other Pueblo communities, right? Some share the same markers that we do, and that's not really a big problem that there's overlapping. So, like I say, those international borders between each Pueblo community were never completely discrete, especially when you think of the mountains and stuff. There's certainly areas that are more discrete, close to the villages that have always been customarily our areas for doing for hunting, for farming, for gathering, things like that are much more around the village directly, right? Mm-hmm. But even when archaeologists refer to the northern Rio Grande Valley, oftentimes they use the term Tewa Basin, right? Because this, not just the area where modern day Española, Alcalde, and then also going up the Chama River, right? All the way in Abiquiu and the Ojo Caliente River and all of those tributaries, right? Going all the way pretty much to where Abiquiu, where it narrows, right? It's kind of like the edge of that whole area. Then going even south of Santa Fe into the Galisteo Basin, where then there's a sort of border area between the Keres-speaking pueblos and Tewa communities, right? So there was a big village that perhaps at times was a Tewa village, and at times was a Keres village, possibly at times was a combined village that the Spanish named San Marcos Pueblo, which is just south of Santa Fe going towards the Cedillos, or right by the Cedillos Hills. And so that was kind of like the big village between the different places.
Porter Swentzell, resident historian and the guy who likes to muddy up the past, making a comeback in this episode to describe the vast and overlapping geography of Tewa country before colonial contact. And it was vast. Imagine, before Don Iwani, aka Don Juan de Oñate, pushed into what the Spanish called the northern frontier in 1598, there were close to 25 Tewa villages. That includes the Tanuan villages south of Santa Fe, and other villages along the northern Rio Grande River. Today, there are 6. While the ancestors of Tesuque Pueblo moved from the area around the village of Agua Fria to the area we currently know as the convention center and the plaza, they eventually moved even further north and away from Santa Fe to be closer to a bigger water source, the Rio Grande. That was around 100 years before the arrival of the Spanish. But even after they moved, this entire region remained a fluid indigenous geography, with sacred sites extending in every cardinal direction. So you mentioned this word overlap, right? That communities overlapped and that sometimes the sacred mountains could be shared. And then the Spanish arrive and to some degree end up overlapping too, right? In different ways. There's conflict, there's sharing. I mean, in terms of that overlap, how would you characterize it?
Well, I think the Spanish definitely they brought an idea of creating much more discrete borders, right? Mm-hmm. And you say the borders of 1 league square around from the corners of the cardinal corners of the church, right? To create sort of this square area, a discrete land base, that belongs just to that. And it wasn't just Pueblo communities, but land grants in general had these sort of discrete borders. That being said, surveys were pretty rare, and the technology that was used is pretty, low tech. And so when they're setting up the sort of boundaries, there was sort of a customary law, right? Like over to that tree over there is where our community can use that area, And so, of course, later on when the Americans invaded this area and started to try to use more advanced technology to survey things out and get it, the lines really discrete, that's where, some of those customary laws, it turns out that oftentimes what people used as sort of the borders of their areas were not necessarily what the original grant was, right?
When the Spanish did arrive and began creating communities in the image of town squares found in the Iberian Peninsula, they took a landscape that was fluid, as Porter says, and imposed strict parameters. This was particularly the case after the first wave of conquistadors paved the way for long-lasting settlement. But settlement was not a seamless process. It was not glorious or even gratifying. In fact, when Pedro de Peralta arrived in New Mexico from Mexico City to take the reins, Daniwani was on his way out. And I mean out, as he was recalled to Mexico City, where he would be tried and convicted of cruelty against native peoples and colonists, and banished forever from New Mexico. He was also banished from Mexico City for 5 years. Back in colonial Santa Fe, conditions were bleak. Many colonists had straight up deserted and returned to El Paso del Norte, leaving only 200 people behind in an outpost that even King Philip II of Spain was on the verge of abandoning. There was neither gold nor silver in this region, just people. So a priest named Lázaro Jimenez made a plea. 7,000 indigenous peoples had converted to Catholicism, he claimed, and that was reason enough to stay. In terms of converted souls, 7,000 was as good as gold because it meant there were also a lot of hands, the kind of manpower needed to construct a city. While slavery was outright banned by the Spanish crown some decades earlier, Peralta was able to invoke the authority of the Spanish repartimiento system, which was basically a compulsory draft. In so doing, he could exact labor from the pueblos of San Marcos, Pecos, Galisteo, San Lázaro, La Cieneguilla, Cochiti, and Santo Domingo to build a colonial center that would hold a church and central plaza, homes, government buildings, and garden plots. The city would also hold, according to Peralta and his surveyor's design, up to 1,000 people, 5,000 head of sheep, 400 head of horses, and 300 head of cattle, all he said without crowding. Many of the people who ended up populating the city would be indigenous, some of whom remained after the initial phase of building, others detribalized, and others still who arrived in subsequent waves, whether by choice or by force. So even as I drive down Paseo de Peralta, a street that loops over itself and probably confuses every newcomer and tourist alike, I am reminded that A, Peralta was only governor of Santa Fe for 3 years and he got a street named after him, and B, Santa Fe was built with indigenous labor. City planning may tell me one thing, but this has always been an indigenous city.
When I do like any kind of like academic or museum talk, that land acknowledgements are an indigenous protocol, and though they have evolved, and though, what I advocate for, which includes information about like settler colonialism and displacement, that is an entirely different practice than like our traditional indigenous protocol. But they have originated within our communities, and um, it's been really hard to develop a timeline, I think, for that reason, because they are like a several thousands of years old practice for most indigenous people. But from what I've been able to pin down, it seems like they started to become like mainstream in Australia in the 70s. Um, I think the practice was started by Aboriginal community members, and then it just started to kind of take effect and become more popularized, and now is pretty standard as either an acknowledgement of country or welcome to country when given by an Aboriginal community member.
Note the difference between indigenous protocol, which according to Felicia Garcia is thousands of years old, and the mainstreaming of land acknowledgements, which in contrast is actually pretty new. Felicia, who is Samala Chumash from Santa Ynez, California, is an expert on this topic, having received her master's degree in arts and sciences museum studies at New York University with a thesis on, you guessed it, land acknowledgements. As the education curator at the Indian Arts Research Center at the School for Advanced Research, or SAR, Felicia draws from her own inseparable ancestral connection to place on the coast of what is now Central California. She is not only from the land, but of the land.
Had more difficulty trying to figure out when it started in Canada, or when it started in the mainstream in Canada. Definitely within the last 10 years or so, it's become much more popularized, with land acknowledgements happening at the beginning of hockey games or in the morning announcements at elementary schools. And many universities in Canada now have acknowledgements on their websites, but that seems to have happened within the last decade. And in the United States, I just feel like this traction has been, I mean, obviously, community members have been advocating for the practice for decades. And, like I said, it's a traditional practice, but within the mainstream, it just seems like within the last 5 years, it's really started to become popularized. We had Taika Waititi give the first ever land acknowledgement at the American Academy Awards this last year. What else? The Democratic National Convention had a land acknowledgement this year for the first time.
And land acknowledgements in the institutional sense, Felicia says, should go beyond saying a few words and then calling it a day. They take work, self-work, community work.
Well, as time goes on, my perspective on land acknowledgement just becomes more complicated, I suppose, because I think even since I've lived in Santa Fe, we've seen a lot more people and institutions start to adopt this practice without really any substantial change in many cases. And by change, I mean inclusion of Indigenous people, Indigenous perspectives, or increased equity. And so I think my perspective on what a land acknowledgement is has changed. And by that, I mean, originally, I really advocated for something that was just an educational statement to kind of open the door to begin having more complicated conversations about, um, decolonial actions, or, the future of the historical narrative, or museums. But I think now my perspective is that acknowledgements need to be much more action oriented.
This last point is important for our own town, which proclaims itself to be a liberal bastion, because even liberal bastions have blind spots, and because many arrive in Santa Fe with some weirdly romantic and blissed out fantasies of place, like the sunlight and the air and the turquoise and the harmonious brown people all laboring in some prelapsarian state. Newsflash, people, we're dealing with some heavy shit here. And despite our internal schisms and the legacy of colonialism we deal with on the daily, the tourism machine that began in the early 1900s to market New Mexico to the rest of America remains so successful that even we see ourselves through the rose-tinted lens of tourism. In many ways, we are caught in a realm, the moon of America, as writer D.H. Lawrence called New Mexico, where we're constantly negotiating between tourist projections of our communities and meaningful relations. That's not to say that those who've grown up here in this region or who have roots in this place haven't fallen prey to other fantasies or oversimplifications, or all of the above. We're all unpacking how waves of colonization have displaced all of us and all of our identities. So, naming Indigenous presence and the complexity that brings, especially in Santa Fe, isn't a diss to another group of people. It's realizing that equity, or lifting up the narratives that have been erased in the mainstream, takes more work. Where there have been the greatest attempts to erase, we need even greater attempts to remember.
I don't think there's anything in a land acknowledgement that is inherently like offensive or hurtful to another group of people unless they're trying to I guess be the only characters in a narrative about a place. I think a lot of people feel that land acknowledgements in a way erase other histories and other communities' ties to a place, and I've seen that particularly in Santa Fe, but to me they're really just, exactly, what they are is acknowledging other people's, indigenous people's connections, and bringing in information that isn't typically included in mainstream historical narratives or contemporary conversations about place. I think indigenous perspectives are overlooked, and we're not trying to overwrite anyone's history or connection. It's just adding another narrative um, to a place.
We've all got to unrevise our revisionist narratives, as Daryl pointed out, and realize together that no one group owns history. More than that, our identities are as fluid as the geography. They change over time. Land acknowledgements are similarly fluid, and when we acknowledge land, we acknowledge ourselves.
Well, I was thinking earlier about the collection of pottery that we are so honored to steward at the Indian Arts Research Center at SAR. And thinking about all of the pots in the collection and how many different communities and places in time and individuals are represented by each pot. And each pot is, in a way, a land acknowledgement. It's built from the earth, decorated by materials from the earth, and the designs most of the time honor things that are from nature.
I think, for instance, of Natalie Diaz's poem, The First Water is the Body, as a land acknowledgement. The Colorado River, she writes, is the most endangered river in the United States. Also, it is part of my body. When Mojaves say the word for tears, she goes on, we return to our word for river, as if our river was flowing from our eyes. A great weeping is how you might translate it, or a river of grief. So we've talked about the elephant in the plaza, the obelisk, but we haven't addressed another elephant in our city, settlerism. Is it a word, a frame of mind, a history, all three? Well, for one, settlerism, the word, concept, all of it is bandied about a lot, and yes, celebrated, by streets that take names like Paseo de Peralta or malls that go by De Vargas, or even schools named after General Kearney, who led the capture of Santa Fe. Settlerism crosses all those time periods and constantly leaks into our built environment and thus our collective consciousness. But what exactly does settlerism mean now? And do settlers self-identify? Do they go around saying, "Hi, I'm a settler"? Here's Diego breaking it down.
So settlerism is the consentless occupation of place and the usurpation of its resources without consideration for the original native people of that region. And it brings in tow with it issues of gentrification and cultural override that really affect and displace people whose families have roots there and who have been there for generations. And, it's a harmful practice that a lot of people don't always know that they're partaking in, but it, brings up histories of colonization and even genocide, and it plays a huge role in marginalizing people and, upholding systems of oppression and racism.
Cultural override, colonization, gentrification, systems of oppression. The list is long. Settlerism in that way is a combo deluxe of cultural behaviors and practices that are rooted in colonization. In that, there is an unchallenged belief that one ethnic group, nationality, or race is so supreme to be entitled to land, people, and economic influence. Let's take, for instance, the April day when Daniwani rolls up on the southern banks of the Rio Grande, proclaiming everything surrounding the river as territory that belonged to the Spanish Empire. Did he ask? No. And even if he did, would he have respected the answer? Probably not. Rather, he believed in his heart of hearts that this place, a place long already occupied, was his to claim. It might be easy to think those behaviors and practices reside solely in the past with the Mayflower, Plymouth Rock, and Daniwani. Settlers are historical, right? Wrong. As Diego points out, the settler baton gets passed on with new waves of people because colonization is ongoing, which means, yes, you can still be a settler in 2020 as much as you could be a settler in 1920, 1820, 1720, and so on. A settler could be the salvage anthropologist who believes he has the right to the wholesale dispossession of entire indigenous communities, taking their cultural heritage because he believes those communities are going extinct. A settler could also be the developer who pays a fee to avoid building affordable housing into his complex, disregarding the communities of color in which displacement is already rampant. A settler could be the herbalist who economically benefits from selling remedies they think they borrowed from other cultures, without actually paying those communities for intellectual property. A settler, finally, could be the tourist promoter who tells you what your culture is to make it saleable, rather than allowing you to determine how best to express it on your own terms.
The ongoing legacy of settlerism, which began with colonization, has been a history of ongoing European occupation in places where people have continued to be marginalized and their resources have continued to be stolen. And like we see in Santa Fe, what we have is a huge, celebration of settlerism in the history of what Santa Fe is told as. And it set the framework for allowing, a lot of outsiders and interlopers and settlers to come in and think they have entitlements to that place, which then, gives them the right to take on political roles where they really shouldn't have any say. It gives them the right to, extract resources from the land and ruin the earth there, or they think it gives them the right to. And it's just an overall really harmful. It's a really harmful phenomenon that is tied to colonialism, but is very much an issue just as harmful in the present.
Let's bring back Artemisio Romero y Carver, who, did I mention, is 18 and hasn't even graduated from high school. He's the Santa Fe Youth Poet Laureate and the kind of young person whose grasp of the impact of colonialism on the present is staggering. Settlerism, Arte says, takes other nefarious forms, not just in individual behaviors that the rest of us might write off as entitlement, but through systems that continually pose harm to land and people, especially BIPOC communities.
There's a reason that we're one of the poorest states and we're one of the brownest states. There's a reason that they tested the atomic bomb here. We are a population that they consider, the least worth maintaining. There's a reason that our entire state is almost entirely a sacrifice zone, right? Why is the single largest and the single cheapest oil field on the planet in New Mexico? Hurting the ability of people to breathe, causing increased rates of stillbirths, potential earthquakes. It's because this is a poor brown population in this state, and they recognize that because of white supremacism, our lives are treated as less than, and so it's much easier for them to take our lives.
So here's the question. How exactly do you deal with settler forces? Here's Arte again.
I think there's two ways to address an issue of injustice. One is what I like to call like first stage or triage, dealing immediately with the material conditions. Right? It would be a lot easier to form a genuinely multicultural city if Santa Fe wasn't segregated, which it is through gentrification. But then the other thing that we have to do is not just by dealing with the material conditions of injustice. We have to deal with the ideological roots of those problems. So that one's a little less like first aid, it's more like diagnostic medicine. And you have to start to look at the ideologies that can justify segregating an entire city and calling it multicultural, right? What are the ideas that allow someone like Alan Weber to think he has claim to make decisions about the obelisk at all? Or to even, act with the authority that he does in a city that his government has occupied in a very violent and colonial way. So the future I see, though, I mentioned that we're under attack. I think that is constantly true. I think the lives of black and brown people, the loss of black and brown lives is required to run the American system. And so as long as the American system runs, we will be under assault. And so then what I can hope, and what I think needs to happen is like genuine solidarity, right?
I imagine that coming to terms with the notion of settlerism and the way that you or your ancestors may have played a role, and I think of myself here too, is much like the stages of grief. First comes denial, then anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. It's not until we go through all of these stages, until we finally accept settlerism for what it fully is, that we can begin to be better, to restore our communities, to acknowledge everyone and everyone's story, including original inhabitants in this beautiful, complicated, and very textured place.
A lot of it just takes, coming at it from a place where in your heart and your core values, you have that intention of building, holistic kinship with everyone, and, really listening to and respecting the original communities as to not displace them, as to not erase them, as to not push them to the margins, as to not harm them. So don't partake in gentrification for one, understand what gentrification is. And from there, just really, intentionally place yourself in that setting with a mindset of, being the best relative you can be.
Now you're talking sense.
Got this pine cone in my brain, got my eyes open, I'm saying it's that wake up, that breaking free for them chains. It's that welcome to a new age, this right here feel like a new wave. Third eye open wide, no flow ride, I decalcify, open up and notice.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Tilt Unsettled. This episode was produced by Alicia with interviews by Diego and post-production by Christian. Our theme song is rapper Wake Self's Holy Water. It can be found on his posthumous album, Ready to Live. Unsettled is a 9-part series. Keep listening on our website at sfai.org or the SFAI channel at podbean.com. This project is supported in part by the National Endowment for the Arts.
Third eye opened up, yo. Bump, bump in the trunk. Third eye opened up, third eye opened up. Keep it alkaline, keep it alkaline.